So, the latest freakout that's in progress is over independent state legislature theory. So, if you do a search on this, you'll find that the internet is just inundated with articles on the left, um, very hysterical articles, making a lot of claims on independent state legislative theory that aren't wholly accurate. Um, First thing to understand is the left is making this primary claim that what the independent state legislative theory is actually about has to do with the choosing of electors for a presidential election. And they're fixating on this because of the couple of attempts during the 2020 election to choose alternate slate of electors should the primary slate of electors been disqualified. Things that have happened and things like that have happened in the past before, but it's part of the left's current hysteria dealing with the former president of the United States. The real issue that's actually in play here is the power to redistrict. And that's the one that gets passing mention because most people don't it's not as a hot button issue. Whereas the idea of the electoral college electors being essentially tossed away and then replaced by a desired slate is a lot more of a sexy topic that'll grab people's attention. I want to quote a couple of things from an article by Richard Pildes, Pildes. He's written extensively on the court dealing with elections, wrote some pretty lengthy papers dealing with the Gore versus Bush fiasco in Florida during the 2000 election. I'm going to quote directly from an article he wrote where he's explaining what exactly independent state legislative theory does not do. Okay. So it would not permit state legislatures to ignore the popular vote in the presidential election and appoint electors after Election Day. Specifically, even in the broadest expansion of looking at the independent state legislature theory, this does not hold water at all. It's not in the context of what they're trying to say. He also says state legislatures, like any other state actor, are bound by due process and equal protection doctrines that apply in the election context. Among other things, this means that state legislatures cannot treat votes unequally or arbitrarily. The brief cites Bush versus Gore, among other cases for this principle, to implement unequal standards for evaluating votes cast, to include only part of the valid votes cast, or to set aside votes altogether, is essentially illegal and unconstitutional, and no one's arguing for the power to do that. Also, quoting again, in addition, due process and equal protection principles deny a state legislature the power to retroactively change the rules, either formally or in practice, under which the votes have been cast. To allow a state legislature to retroactively change the results of a valid federal election implicates similar issues of fundamental fairness that would trigger the protections enshrined in the 14th Amendment. So, one of the things also to take into consideration, let's imagine for a moment that what the left is claiming to be afraid of, the idea of electors being essentially substituted at the last second. Any state that would do this would lose all its state government would lose legitimacy. It would that would probably be the beginning of the breakup of the country. You can't just have a state nullify votes and everyone's just going to shrug their shoulders and go, oh, well, it's in the Constitution. No one's going to stand for it. So it's rather silly. So really, the bulk of this comes down to redistricting, and that's essentially the case that's about to go about in front of the Supreme Court is about. One of the things that's, well, I guess, step back, the short of it is the judiciary has been getting involved in the redistricting process. And the question comes, if the Constitution is read literally, which is the only way you can read it, it says that the legislature is the only one who has the power to deal with this. Now, obviously, if there is countermanding items in a state constitution that allows such intervention, then what the Constitution says is irrelevant on that. So, understanding the whole House of Representatives and districting thing in the first place. So, first thing is to understand what the U.S. Constitution says about districts with the House of Representatives, which is nothing. The idea of how, so essentially the Constitution just says each state's going to get a certain amount of representatives on a proportional basis. So let's say your state gets 10 representatives. The legislature there technically has the ability to come up with any method they want in how those representatives are going to end up being elected. Districts are just the most common and most recent development. It wasn't like this in the beginning. Some states obviously went immediately to some form of districting. A lot of other states elected their representatives as at-large candidates. So if you had 10 candidates in your state, or excuse me, 10 representatives in your state, essentially everybody in the state got to vote on who the 10 representatives were. Sorry about that. My camera's been doing this weird out of focus thing that's I don't know why it's taking so long to catch up with my movements. So the whole districting thing is not something that has to be done in terms of the Constitution at all. Okay, so an interesting artifact when we start, like for instance, the idea of, okay, back to our fictional state with 10 representatives. Let's say a state created 10 districts, one district for each representative. Up until fairly recently, there was no qualification that those districts had to be equal in population size. So you could see what kind of fun politicians would have with that. It allowed to very much tighten down the ability of the ruling party to increase the odds that they were going to get elected the next cycle. It wasn't until the 1960s that the practice of unproportional districts was addressed by the court system. And I believe this was an accurate assessment. Essentially, what they were saying is that the voters of the various districts, because there was a population mismatch, each one was not being treated identically. Essentially, they're not getting equal treatment, equal protection. So one of the terms, if you're not familiar with it, is gerrymandering, which is comes from a legislator from the early 1800s. I can't remember if his first or last name was Jerry, and then they basically added gerrymander because what had happened was they'd drawn a district that vaguely looked like a salamander, and then a political cartoonist drew the map with the salamander-looking district and kind of added eyes and fangs and stuff to it. So the term, because of this politician, got known as gerrymandering. Now, this gerrymandering, the word comes into usage early 1800s, somewhere around 1820. However, the practice of gerrymandering predates the birth of the Republic. It was something that had been practiced forever. It is something that the people drafting the Constitution would have been well aware was a potential to happen. Now, it's possible, I mean, you can't think of everything. The idea of not considering districts in a state could have been some kind of oversight, but I doubt it. It was probably an understanding that the federal government wasn't going to impose upon the state government any additional rules on how they're going to deal with their representatives. So, are you going to have districts? Are you not going to have districts? Up to you. Not part of the Constitution. I think technically, I don't think there's anything that prevents a state. If a state wanted to go to an at-large system, which I think might be actually a pretty good idea, I'd like to see that in play, though. I'm not sure if that would cause more problems or less problems than we have now. But I don't think there's anything preventing a state going back to an at-large system. I don't think it's been codified. Well, obviously it's codified at the state level, but I don't think from a judicial side of things that it's been made a requirement that happens. So for essentially the entire existence of the Republic up through the 1960s, and numerous lawsuits were filed and put forward, the only time gerrymandering became a federal issue is when the districts were unproportional. Okay, so a new wrinkle got added in the 1960s, where they started considering the idea of if the districting process was racially unfair. And this has been upheld in court, and this is something that they've been going for. Now, this is something that potentially, and I've not heard anything specific, but the idea of the racial intentions of a gerrymandering process might be called into question by this ruling as well. And let's look at what the logic problem is here. By saying that, let's say there's an area that's predominantly Hispanic, and they draw a line down the center of it, throwing half the group into one district and half the group into the other. The logic that the anti-racial gerrymandering people would say is, well, that's not fair because they don't get to vote as a distinct group. Well, the flaw of that is assuming that every single person there wants to be represented by the same person and they all think exactly alike because they're Hispanic. That's kind of preposterous. Uh, and a bit racist, really. So I don't see where that's a truly logical argument. I mean, I suppose, I mean, if the Supreme Court upholds that part, I'm not going to be terribly upset because I don't think it comes into play all that much. So essentially, what is coming down here is, does the state legislature have the power to gerrymander? Do they have the power to draw the lines in any way they see fit, uh, with a possible exception that they're not deliberately trying to dilute minority votes? But of course, drawing a line through one group, or basically corralling one group into a district, doesn't that force the minority thought in that group to be slave to the rest of the group's majority? Maybe they'd want to be in another district with people who think like them rather than have the same ethnic background. Just a thought. But so this is pretty much, or this is hysteria. And I would say that the reason the left is so deeply concerned is they probably thought that, and what's been happening is the lower courts have been interfering more and more in the redistricting process, and it's been, when the court interferes, it tends to go the left's way, and uh, I think they're very fearful that the outcome is not going to be to their benefit. Uh, just looking at it at its surface and looking at what the proponents, the people who are filing the amicus briefs, are saying, I would have to say that the Supreme Court would probably be uh, well within the bounds of logic to essentially allow the legislatures to fulfill their duties in drawing districts if a state so chooses to have districts. All right. So, what do you think? Do you think the more sinister ideas the left is throwing out about this case is correct, or do you think the more constrained version I'm talking about is correct? Comment below. What do you think about the exception? Essentially, gerrymandering is okay, with the exception of if you can prove that there's a malicious intent to essentially break up minority groups to dilute their voting power as a bloc. Is that something that should stand, or is that something that should go? Comment below. And I mean, if you have a completely different opinion on what's going on with this, feel free to throw it out. Discussion helps us understand what's going on better. And tell you what, finding the pro arguments was quite an ordeal in terms of searching, because I would say either the people who are defending this are an extreme minority, or the various search engines are doing a fantastic job of throttling this particular opinion. Please smash the like button. If you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. And of course, please consider subscribing. Helps out our channel, helps us get out to other people. Thank you very much for spending time with me tonight. I hope to see you again soon in a future video.